Hey there folks, Graham here and welcome to another dive down the MIDI rabbit hole. Today we're talking MIDI clock. What is it? How does it work? And how can you use it? I've helped many people with my previous videos on MIDI, so stick around and hopefully you'll find something useful here today. And if you've got any questions on this or any of my other content, then please feel free to post them in the comments and I will get back to everyone to see if I can help. MIDI clock is a signal that allows all your equipment to synchronize to a given tempo. This signal is a series of pulses that your synths listen to and can be used to synchronize things like arpeggiators, sequencers, LFOs and other time-based effects across multiple synthesizers. Many synths have their own MIDI clock and enable you to send that out to other synths, and most synths are able to receive MIDI clock. A good bet is that if your synth has a sequencer or arpeggiator like my MODX8 Plus here, or my KeyStep Pro, then it will probably have its own internal MIDI clock. If it doesn't have an arpeggiator or sequencer, like my Behringer Neutron over here, then it will probably only receive MIDI clock. So how does it work? Well, the standard measure for the pulses sent by MIDI clock is 24 pulses per quarter note. And as you increase or decrease tempo, the speed of these pulses increases or decreases. But no matter the speed, it is always 24 pulses per quarter note. There are some exceptions to this rule, but we're not going to cover those today because today we're just looking at standard MIDI clock. Now a little music theory. I promise nothing complicated. 1 quarter note equals 1 beat, and in standard 4/4 time, there are 4 beats per bar, with 1 bar equaling 1 whole note or measure. Next, the standard tempo for most modern songs is around 120 beats per minute, give or take, and indeed you'll find in all DAWs like Cubase and Logic Pro, the default tempo is generally 120. So at 120 beats per minute, there is 1 beat or quarter note every half a second. That means 24 pulses every half a second. But at 180 beats per minute, we're squeezing more beats into the same length of time, and there is now 1 beat every third of a second, which is 24 pulses every third of a second. So the faster the beats per minute, the faster the pulses. But as we know, 24 pulses always equals 1 quarter note. It's these pulses that your synths listen to and use to calculate the tempo. The pulses can then be further divided down or multiplied up to create different note lengths. For example, we know that 24 pulses equals 1 quarter note. Therefore, 12 pulses will equal an 8th note, 6 pulses a 16th note, 3 pulses a 32nd note, and 1 pulse a 64th note. But if we go the other way, 48 pulses equals a half note, and 96 equals a whole note. There are also other subdivisions for dotted notes and triplets, as shown in the chart. This is great, but how do I use it to sync all my gear? First thing to understand is there are effectively 2 modes of MIDI clock, master and slave. The master sends the clock signal and the slaves receive the clock signal, matching their tempo to it. You would normally have 1 master and then as many slaves as you want. And many different things could be used as your master clock depending on how you want to work. It could be a dedicated clock for everything to sync to, a synth that transmits MIDI clock, a MIDI keyboard that transmits MIDI clock, a drum machine, or even the DAW on your computer. All synths that send or receive MIDI clock will have settings that allow you to determine whether they're a master or a slave. And these tend to be named things like internal, USB, MIDI, DIN, external, or auto. Here, for example, is the sync setting screen from my Polybrute. Internal means that the synth will obey whatever tempo you set using its own internal settings and will ignore any other clock data that it receives. USB means that the synth will ignore its own internal clock and obey whatever signal it receives over USB, for example, from your DAW. MIDI, or DIN here, means that it will again ignore its own internal clock and obey whatever signal it receives via its MIDI in port. And auto means it will use its own internal clock unless it receives a signal from somewhere else, in which case that will override the internal clock and be used for the tempo. Your synths will most likely have similar settings, but the way in which you access them will vary. For some like the Polybrute I just showed, it'll be accessed via the settings menu viewable on a screen on the synth. For others, it may be via a software editor like this for my Matrix Brute. You'll see here I've got MIDI clock source and MIDI, and if I click it, I get a drop down with all USB, MIDI or sync. Some may use dip switches like my KeyStep 37, and for some it may be a combination of button presses. For example, the Behringer TD3. Here you would hold down the back and right buttons simultaneously and then press key 1, 2 or 3 for internal MIDI or USB as the clock setting. The second thing is that MIDI clock is effectively universal in that it is broadcast simultaneously across all 16 MIDI channels. So if you have a lot of synths all set to different MIDI channels, they will all still receive the master MIDI clock signal. Also, MIDI clock is constantly being broadcast so that all the connected equipment is always in sync. Next, we need to look at how MIDI clock is transmitted and received. There are two ways the clock can be sent and received: via a good old-fashioned MIDI cable or via USB. With MIDI, you can connect one synth to another and have the first synth control the tempo of the other, the first being the master, using its own internal clock, and the other being the slave, which syncs to the external clock that it's receiving. With a USB cable, you can, for example, send the tempo from your DAW, like Cubase or Logic Pro, and have your synths sync to that. And with a combination of the two, you can send the tempo from your DAW via USB to a synth or controller to govern its MIDI clock, and then have it send that clock out as a master to all the other synths over MIDI. And last but not least, we need to understand start-stop messages. These are MIDI messages telling the sequencer or arpeggiator on a synth to start or stop playing. These are separate from clock in that they're not being permanently broadcast, but like MIDI clock, they are universal, being sent to all MIDI channels, and most synths will have the ability to either send or not send start-stop data, and to either receive or not receive the data. Like the MIDI clock, you can usually configure this in the settings on your synth. So how does this all work in reality, and how do you use it? Well, to finish, I'm going to show you how this all works in my studio, what acts as a master, what acts as a slave, etc. So here is my current setup. There are a few other things in reality, but here I'm just focusing on the things I want to sync to MIDI clock. Effectively, I have three main ways of controlling the tempo across all my synths. First, I wanted my TR-8S drum machine to act as a master clock for all my hardware synths. This is because my key steps only send out clock data when their sequencers are running, and so needed to control the clock from elsewhere when this wasn't the case. Then I wanted to be able to override the TR-8S with my KeyStep Pro, so when a sequence is triggered on the KeyStep, everything else locks to it. And finally, I wanted to override everything with my DAW, Cubase in this instance, so that when I'm recording, I can lock everything to the DAW tempo. So first, I have my drum machine set to send MIDI clock and start-stop to all my other hardware synths. And the MIDI clock on the drum machine is set to auto, so it uses its own internal clock unless it receives a MIDI clock message from somewhere else. All the other hardware is then set to sync to either MIDI or auto and to receive start-stop messages. So now I can trigger all my hardware synths using the drum machine and everything will stay in sync. For example, pressing start on the drum machine will start the sequencers on my hardware synths, the Matrix Brute and Polybrute in this instance, and as I turn the tempo dial on the drum machine up and down, everything else will stay in sync with it, like this. Second, I have my KeyStep Pro, which, when armed to play a sequence, becomes the master clock. The KeyStep Pro clock is set to auto and sends its MIDI clock and start-stop messages to my KeyStep 37 over on the desk. The KeyStep 37 has its clock set to MIDI, so it ignores its own internal clock and instead takes the clock signal from the KeyStep Pro. The KeyStep 37 then passes this MIDI clock signal onto the drum machine. And as the drum machine clock is set to auto, it now ignores its own internal clock and instead takes its cue from the KeyStep Pro and sends that clock signal out to everything else. So now, instead of starting everything from the drum machine, I can start it from the KeyStep Pro. And if I change the tempo on here, everything else will remain in sync, like this. And then finally, at the top of this hierarchy, I have my DAW, Cubase in this instance, sending out MIDI clock and start-stop messages over USB. And if I change the clock settings on my KeyStep Pro to USB, it will take its clock from the DAW and pass that out to everything else. And then when I press play or record in my DAW, everything else will start and stop in time with it and will keep to the same tempo. In order to facilitate this, you'll have to go into your DAW and configure where and how you want the MIDI clock data to be sent. It'll usually be in something like synchronization settings. Here on the screen is my project synchronization setup from Cubase, and you can see under MIDI clock destinations, I've chosen the KeyStep Pro. And I can also choose other parameters, such as whether I want the MIDI clock to always send start messages and whether I want it to send MIDI clock in stop mode. And of course, if you don't want certain synths to start and stop along with everything else, then as mentioned earlier, you can just change their internal settings to reflect that. And that's it. That's what MIDI clock is, how it works, what you can do with it, and how I use it to keep everything in sync across my studio. Well, I hope you found this useful, and if you have, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. And if you have any questions, please post them in the comments, and I will get back to everyone to see if I can help. Also, any other comments or feedback are, of course, highly appreciated. But for now, I've been Graham. Take care and catch you later.